Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to thank the Nalla Feminist Collective for this invitation and convey my regrets for not being able to join you in person for this important inaugural Nalafem Summit. I would like to express my gratitude to Mrs. Aya Shebi, chair of the Nalla Feminist Collective and former African Union Envoy on Youth, for her leadership and efforts to mobilize women and girls across Africa in the diaspora to bridge the gap between policy and implementation in terms of gender equality and women's rights, as well as between global bodies and grassroots organizations, and between the generations. I would like to commend Nalafem for its groundbreaking Beijing Plus 25 Manifesto, a political document that sets out critical issues of concern for young African women and calls for advancing gender equality as part of Agenda 2063 and Agenda 2030. My mandate to lead and cohere efforts across the UN system to end the scourge of conflict-related sexual violence was built on the foundations laid in Beijing. It was this language, framed by the women's movement, which provided the precedent for Security Council Resolution 1820 of 2008, which condemned sexual violence as a tactic of war and an impediment to peace building. The Beijing Platform for Action raised the alarm and helped to catalyze a shift in paradigm and perspective. Today, the notion of sexual violence as a tactic of war and terrorism, rather than a private tragedy, an inevitable byproduct of war, or mere collateral damage, has traveled from the 1995 Beijing World Conference to the United Nations Security Council in New York. Since taking office as Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict, I have engaged with the authorities in several countries where conflict-related sexual violence has been used as a tactic of terrorism, namely Iraq, Mali, Nigeria, and Somalia. In the context of Nigeria, Boko Haram factions, affiliates, and splinter groups continue to carry out brutal attacks, including mass abductions of women, girls, and boys. This violence disproportionately affects civilians, resulting in mass displacement and heightened risk of sexual violence. When I visited Maiduguri, northeastern Nigeria in 2017, I met with hundreds of young women in crowded displacement camps who had been released from Boko Haram captivity and were holding babies born as a result of rapes by Boko Haram fighters. These young women suffered the double tragedy of rape and rejection by their own families and communities. Indeed, even after leaving, escaping, or being rescued from an armed or terrorist group, survivors and children born of rape face a high risk of re-victimization, stigma, and long-term health and psychosocial consequences. For instance, some survivors, in particular abductees, have endured multiple pregnancies, given birth in insecure areas where services are absent, and as a result have suffered a range of reproductive health problems, including traumatic fistula. Terrorist and violent extremist groups use rape, sexual slavery, and other forms of sexual violence to recruit new fighters, to terrorize communities into submission, to displace populations from strategic areas, to torture and extract intelligence, to compel conversion and indoctrination through forced marriage, and to generate revenue through sex trafficking, the slave trade, and extorting ransoms. Wartime rape is shrouded in a long history of silence and denial, which shields the perpetrators and allows impunity to prevail. Ladies and gentlemen, in line with the theme of this summit, I would say I am Nalla, because my role is to amplify the voices of survivors and bridge them to policy and decision-making forums. Women's rights are human rights, and they are universal in times of war and peace. It is time to silence the guns and unmute the voices of women. Allow me to conclude with a call to action to governments, regional organizations, journalists, traditional and religious leaders, young women feminists, Nigerian feminists, and survivors themselves. All of you participating in this summit have a critical role to play in your respective spheres of expertise and influence. To eradicate sexual and gender-based violence, we must join forces, leveraging our comparative advantages for maximum impact. We need to expand the circle of allies, stakeholders, and champions, and sustain the political momentum generated in recent years to propel real change for survivors and communities at risk. We must mobilize national political leadership and marshal resources equal to the scale of the challenge. Conflict-related sexual violence is an expression of entrenched gender-based inequality as exacerbated by militarization, insecurity, and institutional collapse. We have the power to transform harmful patriarchal norms and stereotypes and to close gender parity gaps. The future of gender equality and gender justice is in our hands. We bear a massive responsibility for the legacy that we bequeath to future generations. I thank you for your shared commitment to this cause.